Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Montgomery College's Cultural Arts Center. My name is Brad Stewart, and I'm the Vice President and Provost for this campus. I think most of you know that. We have a VIP in the audience, so I'd like to give a shout out to Councilmember Peter Kovar, who's here. We're very pleased that you're here tonight for the second meeting in the design charrette process for the Catherine and Isiah Leggett Math and Science Building. We're glad you could all make it here tonight, and we're looking forward to working with you this evening on the design charrette process. Be sure, if you need some information when we're not together meeting, that you go to the website that'll appear on the screen, where all the resources and everything that we've talked about during the design charrette meetings is up on the website. So the college has made a commitment to respond to every comment that you guys give us, and I think we're caught up now for a second, and we'll start again right away tomorrow morning processing tonight's comments. Now I'd like to introduce the people who are going to sort of run the show tonight. Michael Aitken from Link Strategic Partners and Bob Bull from Smith Group JJR.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Sandra. Those are very large pictures of us. So Link Strategic Partners, we're a community engagement, stakeholder engagement firm based up the street in Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C. As I said last time, we do work around the country. Our whole goal and our whole job is to make sure that the community engagement is transparent, authentic, and used throughout the process. We're not the designers, we're not the architects. I'm ambivalent on what's built where. My job is to make sure that everything that you say is captured, heard, responded to, and used in every subsequent meeting. So I'll be leading us through the beginning of this meeting, and then I'll turn it over to Bob from Smith Group. We're covering a lot of information tonight. It's kind of apropos that we're in a college group here because we've got a lot of studying to do together. I don't want to scare anyone about the level of detail we're going to go into tonight, but it's pretty substantial. In many design processes, the level of detail you're going to see tonight is really what's generally shared with the internal client first. We're trying to make this as transparent as possible, so we're going to go into some pretty granular detail to allow us to get to the most important part of the meeting, which is going to be breakout groups, where you sit with us and the architects to really ask questions, play with the models, look at the boards, and give us feedback to make this better. So here's the agenda for tonight. We're going to spend the first few minutes, and by a few minutes, we're going to spend about 40 or so minutes together here getting an overview of what we learned the last time we were all together, how that's influenced the design decision. Then we're going to break up into work groups. When you came in, you got a number on your name tag that'll just help break us up into smaller, more manageable groups. If you're sitting next to someone and you really want to go with them to a group, feel free. We're just trying to break it up into groups that allow us to actually have dialogue instead of you being talked at the whole time. And then we're going to come back together at the end of the meeting to get report outs from the small groups. The goal is to make sure everyone understands what everyone else talked about in these meetings so it stays open and transparent throughout. Next slide. Okay, we are going to start by going through the feedback that we got at the last meeting. And you can go ahead to the next slide. For those of you who were at the last meeting, show of hands, how many people were here last time? Excellent. Most people, not all of you, so we'll do a little bit of recap, but we had 4 engagement stations where after you heard the presentation, we collected feedback on Post-it notes. We also did a Q&A, and we collected feedback forms. All of what was written up there, everything that was asked in person and everything that was in the feedback form has been cataloged into an issues exhibit that lives on the website. There were about 75 individual pieces of feedback that were collected last time. You can't read this. You're not intended to read this. This is all printed in giant boards out in the hallway as well, and it lives online. When you go online, just to orient you to this, all comments are transcribed verbatim. There was no editing done to anything we heard. They're also grouped into different categories to help for sorting as we get more and more feedback. And then the college and the design team is taking the additional step of responding to every single comment or question. So we're going to continue to do that throughout. Sometimes it'll be like a question about when was this decision made? And so it's really helpful to be able to add a hyperlink to where in the process previously that was made. Sometimes there were direct questions asked, how are you going to address X, Y, or Z? That's answered in there. And sometimes the answer is going to be, we're not at that point of the process yet, but this is when we will get there. So throughout, there's been a commitment made from the college that everything that's asked will get an answer and it'll be posted online. If I had to categorize what we heard into 5 overall themes, and we'll be walking through these tonight in a pretty great level of detail, they're up here on the board. Engagement process, environmental considerations, internal considerations, design elements, and construction considerations. We will start with the engagement process. The questions around that, and you can go to the next slide, were how do we make sure that if we miss a meeting, how do we make sure that as we head into the summer, if we're not at a meeting, how do we make sure our voice isn't left out? So I want to remind everyone about the feedback loop that we covered in the last meeting. This is how we're going to be processing feedback throughout. We're going to present to you some new information. We're going to listen to what you have to say. We as a team then take that back and analyze it. We work with the architects, the designers, the college, et cetera, to make sure we're really understanding what's in it. And then in every meeting when we come back together, we'll report out what we heard and how that influenced that next iteration of design. So that will be an ongoing process throughout every step forward. If you go to the next slide, we're at stage 2 of the 5-step process we talked about last time. So introduction was meeting 1. Today, you're actually going to start seeing some forms and some designs and some concepts and where they could live on the site. We'll then be going forward through a summer engagement period, which I'll break down here in just a little bit. We'll come back together in September for another design charrette, another one in late September, mid-October. It'll then go to mandatory referral, which the designers can talk about what that means, and we'll come back together for a 5th meeting. So we're still very early in this process, though there's a lot to get through in each meeting. So if at any point this isn't making sense, please stop us, and we'll go forward. Summer is a very tough time to do large-scale engagement. We're aware of that. We know some people travel. Some people can't come out to evening meetings. We heard last time that not every meeting can be on a Thursday. We're taking all of this feedback and trying to make sure that we're making the process better as we go forward. We're going to have 3 different office hours. We're at a college, so office hours seemed appropriate. As you see them up there, August 1st, 7th, 13th, dates, times, locations are up there. What that means is during those hours, the architects, the planners, the college staff, and my engagement team will be here and willing to meet with anyone who comes by. It can be one-on-one, it can be small group, etc. You don't need to make a reservation, just come by and engage with us as personally as you want to. We will also, over the summer, we'd very much like to go out and meet with small groups, civic groups, community groups. If you let us know where that engagement should happen and when meetings might be taking place, let us know sooner rather than later so that we can get them on our calendar and we'll go out and do that engagement. My team is running an engagement station out in the lobby throughout the course of the evening. If you have any specific meetings, people we need to talk to, places we need to go, just throw that on a Post-it note out there and we'll make sure we get back to you on all of that. And then finally, in August, I think it was the 14th, we're going to do an exterior tour of the building in the evening. Sometimes when you're actually getting to the design charrette, it helps to be able to walk the site with the architects and the planners to really get a feel for what this looks like, and we're going to be making that available that evening. The other 2 themes, next 2 key themes we heard, there was quite a bit of feedback around what I would call environmental considerations. This was everything from what level of LEED certification will be achieved here to what are the environmental impacts of construction and how do we remediate for that. A lot of those types of questions, and the college wanted to make sure that we were addressing those early in the process. So also out in the lobby throughout the course of the evening tonight, we have an environmental engagement station set up. Is Sharmala here? Right here. This is one of Montgomery College's experts in all things environmental. She will be hosting an engagement station out in the hallway to answer really specific questions throughout, as will the architects and planners that are here today. Construction considerations kind of fall in this category as well. There are a lot of questions about what is the impact of construction, how do we minimize the noise and dust impact of construction on the community. It's a little early in the process to have really specific answers to that, but it's something we're going to be keeping in mind throughout. So we want to make sure you know it's heard and will be part of the presentation you're seeing going forward. And then finally, internal considerations, before I turn this over to Bob. This is a kind of catch-all group for things we heard from faculty, students, staff. There were a not insignificant number of comments that got into the level of detail of, I'm a faculty member and I want to know how my office is going to be assigned. Or I'm a student and I want to know if the lab is going to have enough places to charge my devices. Those are all very good things and we need to hear them at this point of the process, but they're slightly different than some of the neighborhood concerns about what the building and the massing will look like for the outside. So we wanted to put those in one specific bucket to make sure that we're really giving them the due that they need. Tonight, if you fall within kind of that category and self-identify as student, faculty, or staff, and you really want to get into granular level detail around the internal considerations of the building, we're going to ask you to go to meeting room number 1, and we'll have the architects, planners there really ready to dig into that level of detail, whereas the other rooms will be more reserved for neighborhood level feedback about building massing, etc. Next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Bob from the Smith Group, and this is going to be the rest of the presentation. I said at the beginning, and this is not to intimidate anyone, but we're going to get into a pretty significant level of detail here. So if we start to use words that you don't understand or there's an architectural concept, just throw your hand up. We're more than happy to clarify and make sure we're walking through this together. Then I'll come back up, divide us up, and we'll get into our design charrettes. Bob?
All right. Thank you, Michael. I'll also say that, yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. So let me start at the end of that. Going forward, I think it's completely fair to ask for these to be posted with enough time to review them. The time between these first 2 meetings was much tighter than the rest of the schedule, so they're all up there. But going forward, absolutely, we should aim for that. What you will see in Bob's discussion, almost everything he's presenting is a direct response to something we heard. So we'll say, we heard this, and the design can incorporate it this way. Some of them are as direct as, we heard this question, and here's the answer to it. Some of them are, we heard a bunch of questions about this, and this is what the massing looks like. But you should be able to sit through this and know that the questions informed what you're about to see. It should be very, very direct.
All right, so as Michael was saying, we are going to cover a lot of material. We do have a team of architects as well, sitting right here. These are Smith Group staff. They're going to be part of the engagement breakout groups later tonight. So if there are any specific questions that I may run through kind of quickly that is maybe not as clear as it could be, they will be available to answer some of those questions because they're just as familiar with the project and everything we're presenting tonight as I am. So feel free to either ask me as I'm presenting it, or if you're more comfortable in the smaller group, you can ask the rest of the architectural team directly. So as Michael said, we're going to summarize some of the feedback that we got and try to respond in a meaningful way with each of the sort of thematically organized issues. One of the comments that we heard pretty consistently was that the demolition of Falcon Hall and the construction of the new Math and Science building was going to take away some very important athletic facilities that are currently on the campus. And that what is the college's commitment to athletics going forward. And if any of you are familiar with the master plan that the college has already committed to, they will be building a new athletics and fitness facility at some point in the future. Unfortunately, because of the constraints of the current campus, you cannot build that building concurrently with the new Math and Science building. So there has to be a series of dominoes that have to go into a phased approach to be able to implement the new Math and Science building, which takes a priority, and the health and fitness building will come online at some point in the future. Currently, the one site that is being considered is the one due north of our current project site, where Science North is. Yeah, so like I said, it is at some point in the future, but I do not. No, I can't really give you any details on the funding for that and what the state and county protocol is for funding. So I cannot. So one of the specific comments that we got, and actually it was a verbal question during the last presentation, was what is the height of the trees? I know we've talked and we've heard a lot. We'll talk again about the importance of the triangular space just south of the project site. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but here's current Falcon Hall. There's a green space that is bracketed by the existing parking area, Fenton Street, and Takoma Avenue. that is populated by a series of very mature trees. Well, some mature, some not so mature. As part of our construction process, the college has commissioned a survey of that area, and we actually have very detailed information now on what the current tree species are that are there, their height and their age. And you can see documented on this slide, we have quite a variety. Some are deciduous, some are evergreen, and they range in height from 18 feet to over 75 feet. The good aspect of this is that you have a variety of different types of foliage that will provide screening throughout the year. So you have evergreens and the deciduous that provide the high shade canopy. No matter what we do in construction over the existing Falcon Hall site, this area is not going to be dramatically impacted. There is no plan to do any construction in that area, and most of those trees should maintain their existence into the future. Obviously, there is a recognition that not all trees may be healthy, and there may be sort of a lifespan issue with any of the current trees, but that would be something that would be a completely different issue relative to the construction of the project. So now we'll move into some of the major design themes that drive some of the design concepts that you'll be seeing later in the presentation. So designing a math and science building today is a lot different than what went into some of the original buildings that are on the campus and some of the buildings of the past decades. There's a current pedagogy that relies on active learning. So this is a less formalized instructional technique where it's not about a format like this where somebody stands and lectures to a class, but it's more of an active, engaged process where students actually learn from each other. They engage with professors in unique settings like laboratories and in informal areas outside the formal classroom. And it's those aspects of the current sort of teaching methodology that have been proven to be more successful, that students come out of those programs with a much higher retention of the information that they're being taught, and they are much more successful in their careers. So the current planning and design aspects for the project that we are embarking on the design on will take on a lot of these characteristics. These are some images of the current facility that the math and science programs are in today, and the college has actually done a very commendable job to try to achieve some of these more contemporary teaching approaches within the existing facilities, but it's very limited in its structure, and they're really running into some serious limitations with the existing building, necessitating this project. And the aspirations for the new design is to be this much more open, engaged, flexible space where you'll have teaching on display. There will be activity within the building that where students and faculty can engage not only in formal settings but informal settings. Students will have opportunities to learn from each other in informal teaching commons and group study areas. And classrooms can be reconfigured into different formats to address specific teaching approaches for particular programs. Another big theme, and we heard this a lot in the comments, was sustainability and environmental design. We're going to touch on a little bit of that tonight, but this is something that's going to run through the entire design process. There are aspects of sustainable design that will drive everything from very basic building massing organization that we're going to talk about tonight, all the way down to how construction is managed and how stormwater management is managed on the site. It's just important to note that the college has made a commitment to be, and it's actually as part of the state's commitment for a state-funded project, to be LEED certified. We will be LEED Silver on this project, and it means that there's going to be a significant amount of environmental consideration into all aspects of the design and the construction process. All right, so this one is a little abstract, so there may be some questions on this one, but this is called a solar rose that you're seeing. There are two images on the slide. The one on the left is basically the solar orientation on our particular project site in the summer for the Washington, D.C. area. So you can sort of see the very lightly ghosted in the background. That's the project site. So Fenton Street here, Takoma Avenue, here's that triangular park-like setting south of the site. So basically what this is telling us is in the peak summer solstice, the majority of the solar radiation comes from the west. Not a big surprise, it's pretty conventional to understand that. But what this is telling us as architects is like, that's not a good place to put a lot of transparent glazing, because it'll essentially create a very uncomfortable environment that is difficult to maintain heat and cool, or actually cool in the summer months, creating a lot more energy demand on the systems. So a smart design or passive design strategy would be to put something organized on this part of the campus that doesn't have a lot of windows, or like we, as architects, like to call fenestration. And to, when you do have windows or do have anything oriented on that side of the site, that you use some kind of screening device or device to dissipate that heat gain to minimize the cooling load within the building. So a companion to that is the winter solstice diagram. So obviously the sun changes its orientation in the winter, and we get a sun pattern that really, to take advantage of it, would allow a sun penetrating from the south into the building that would be, if organized correctly, the massing of the building could be heated up in the winter, allowing the sun to reduce the heating load within the building. There's two other aspects of these slides or these images that I'd like to point out, and that is where the sun is not. So the very slight little blue areas that you see basically to the east and facing the campus, those are the areas where you don't get a lot of direct solar gain. They're actually ideal locations to put glazing. If you're going to put windows in the building, that's a very good place to put it, where you're not going to have a lot of heat gain or glare that could be problematic for the internal functions. Conveniently, it's the area of the site that faces the campus. So it's actually playing in very well to some of the commitments that have already been made and some of the aspirations for this project that we've been talking about. So another thing I want to touch on briefly is the design program. This is a very complicated diagram, but essentially what it's representing is all the different compartments or spaces that are meant to be housed in the building when it's complete. So as you can see, it's organized in columns. Each department has its own column, and the small boxes on the top, the purple ones, indicate classrooms, and the orange-ish and burnt orange color are laboratories, and the small blue ones are office areas. So one important aspect to note is that the biology department is the largest. It has most of the laboratories. And just based on very quick analysis, to get this program organized on the site is going to take at least 2 floors. That immediately is a compromise from that program. Once you break up a program into multiple floors, they lose some interconnectedness. They lose the ability to have some of those spontaneous interactions between students and faculty. The more you spread out a program vertically within a building, the less you get that sort of synergy between different aspects of the program and the individuals that are part of it and the facilities that are allocated to it. So it's an important thing to note that this program, in an ideal scenario, does have a lower floor-to-floor organization to maximize that interconnectedness between the different program elements. So before we actually get into the formalized design concepts that we were going to present to you, we thought we'd go through some initial sort of due diligence, and that is testing some of the considerations that have been brought up by a variety of different individuals as part of this initial process. So just to remind everybody, some of the commitments that the college has already made in the design directives. This is the diagram we showed you last time, which is the site analysis. So the very first comment there was to keep the setback of Falcon Hall along Takoma Avenue. So we talked last time that the current Falcon Hall is about 110 feet away from Takoma Avenue. And that is the edge of the current Falcon Hall. You can sort of see ghosted in here. I'll give you a little bit more orientation if you aren't familiar with what we're looking at, but this is Fenton Street coming along the west, Takoma Avenue along the south, New York Avenue on the east, the Commons Building, the Resource Center, and the Science North. So we talked briefly about number 2, which is protect the park-like setting on the southwest corner. Minimize the windows along Takoma Avenue. We will talk a little bit more about that as we move forward in some of the design concepts. Ensure a height no more than 2 stories on Takoma Avenue. And if you remember last time, that's where we talked about this 70-foot setback, where we're saying that that is the limit of that 2-story projection of height of the building site, and that everything else beyond that would ideally have a higher height limitation. Use the existing topography to minimize the perceived height. For those of you that are familiar with the site, there's about a 10-foot grade difference from Fenton Street down to the interior part of the campus. So ideally, if we nestle the building into the grade somewhat, we can reduce the perceived height of the building along Fenton Street and also Takoma Avenue. And then locate rooftop equipment away from Takoma Avenue. So obviously this is a commentary about trying to avoid any conflict with the existing residences that are along Takoma Avenue. So trying to organize some of the ventilation equipment associated with the laboratories in this general area along Fenton Street, where it has less potential to disrupt any of the neighborhood context on the south side. And then to maximize the building width and lower the height. So basically saying to minimize its vertical expression and maximize the width of the building. All right, so just a summary of where we are, and here is the current Falcon Hall represented in that model. Yeah. Those are trees. No, so there is a bit of an abstraction associated with some of these images. We are like at a concept level. So there's a representational depiction of many of the trees. I believe all the trees in this general area we've tried to get scaled and have the right species represented in the diagram, but it is still just a diagram. Yeah. That's something we will be considering. There's actually, we have a specialist on our team, an acoustician, who will be evaluating that for us. But they're also evaluating train noise and things like that on the site. So we'll have not only noises emanating from the building, but noises penetrating into the building that will need to be assessed. Yeah. Yeah. The diagram was actually showing over Science North. So it was not the resource center that it was showing at that. That unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the master plan and all the moves associated with that. I think we can get back to you on that if you want to submit that as a. Oh, okay. So the question was when the health facility goes in, that the resource center would go somewhere else, and the question is, where does it go? Right. Okay. We good? All right. So one of the things that was a comment, and we thought we would study is, again, sort of a process in due diligence. What would happen if we built the building exactly in the footprint of the existing Falcon Hall? What would happen? So as you can see, this is a very strict interpretation of the footprint of Falcon Hall existing. And if we tried to limit building mass along Takoma Avenue and limit that to 2 stories, as was part of the commitment by the president, then the rest of the building would extend significantly above the northern part of this site to the point where it is 1 story below grade. Okay, 1 story below grade, 5 stories above grade, and then on top of that would be the mechanical equipment associated with the laboratories. On the campus side, you'd get 1 extra story, 6 stories exposed because of the slope in the site, the 10-foot slope. So one of the big issues with this is that it's out of context for the residential community. So a building of that size would be recognizably out of scale from almost any vantage point around the campus and as viewed from any of the sort of surrounding community vantage points. It also, as we were talking before, when you vertically distribute the program, you create a lot of internal issues or conflicts between the programmatic adjacencies. So from an internal programming point of view, this does not work very well from a higher education facility, especially one with laboratories focused on science and math. So there was another set of considerations that we were asked to look at, and this was if we actually build a 2-story element or a building that was on the existing Falcon Hall site, but minimized its height to match the current Falcon Hall, the remaining building mass would have to be pushed towards the center of the campus. So very similar to that last scheme, you get a very significant amount of mass and building bulk along this side of the campus. So it'd be about 6 stories with a 2-story element residing over the existing Falcon Hall. One of the things that is a real detriment of this particular idea is that what would naturally be in these areas would be the laboratories. So as we were saying before, the laboratory facilities tend to not need a lot of windows. They're actually very good to be organized along Fenton Street and facing west to take advantage of that solar orientation. And in this particular scheme, that orientation is flipped. Ideally, in this lower bar is where you would have some of those more engaged aspects of the design, where you would have more transparency, more glass, more of the sort of highly active parts of the program that would want to spill outside of the building. And it's actually in an area where it is adjacent to Fenton Street and the outside of the campus. Ideally, these two would be inverted from a programmatic point of view. Sure. Yeah, so we talked about last time, we didn't put it in this slide deck, but ideally in a laboratory facility, a story is 16 feet. So these images do represent stories at 16 feet. Yes, sir. Larger structure over here. Right here, 6 stories. Yeah, so and keep in mind there's, when we say 6 stories here, we're saying 6 stories, and then there's always an additional level of mechanical equipment on top that could be perceived as a story, but it's ideally it would be mechanical equipment with a screen wall around it, so it may not actually be an occupied floor. Any other questions? Yeah. So north is up, generally this direction. Again, so Fenton Street here. Here are the CSX tracks, Takoma Avenue, New York Avenue. These are the existing residences that are just south of Takoma Avenue, and the Commons Building, Resource Center, Science North. Anything else? Okay, so we thought, okay, what would happen if we actually deviated from that last concept slightly and put some of the massing back onto that area right above Falcon Hall? So we distributed some of the mass, brought this building down, and slipped it over onto that other mass on top of Falcon Hall. And this does tend to get closer to what we were saying about the ideal floor distribution of the program, where you try to get it within 3 or 4 levels. But what it does do that's not so great is it, again, has that sort of flipped orientation where laboratories would likely want to be on the campus side, and you have this sort of open, transparent, and active part of the program on off campus or facing Fenton Street, facing the public side. And the distribution of the floor would create a very large footprint where there would be no natural light that would be penetrating into some of the central large masses of a building that is organized in this way. So we took that as a very, well-hearted lesson and approached the design with some of the knowledge from those studies to come up with 3 other concepts that actually build on top of the lessons learned. So we'll run through these 3 options, and then these 3 options will be what we will be talking about in the breakout groups later tonight. So the first one we're calling framed edge. And basically what this means is it's trying to organize the building, similar to what I've been saying, where the laboratories, which are these white boxes, are organized in a bar, in this particular option, a bent bar, on the west side of the campus, adjacent to Fenton Street. Now we talked, I know there was a lot of questioning and concern about the setback on Fenton. So this blue box is establishing the building limit line, or the area in which we can build. This particular scheme is showing that the mass of the building, or the edge of the building, would be set back beyond that setback line to a point where it aligns with Science North. And just to give you a little more orientation, I know these are 3-dimensional graphics. Sometimes people are a little challenged with seeing the 3rd dimension in these, but basically what you're seeing is a basement. And this floor plate is being pushed down into the ground. So you're seeing what we've been talking about is suppressing the building 1 story below grade and having a recessed lower floor to take advantage of the site topography and minimize the height on Fenton Street. So 2 other aspects of this design that I'd like to point out is that bracketed within that laboratory bar are 2 elements. One is the planetarium, and the other one is the learning center. So when I was talking earlier about the components within the program that really want to have a lot of transparency, they really want to be engaged with the outside and have lots of windows and access to natural light, that is the learning center. This is where there's a lot of tutoring going on. There's a lot of study rooms. It's kind of like a more contemporary version of the library in today's standards. And then the planetarium, which is actually kind of the opposite of that, in that it's a very internally focused programmatic element. It doesn't have a lot of windows. It's really an internally focused element into itself. So in this particular scheme, what we're doing is we're saying that the planetarium could act as a screen to the neighborhood. So it doesn't need to be as tall. It actually doesn't have any windows. It's not actually on the setback, but further back, and it can be much lower. So it would be ideally screening some of this activity that may be happening internal to the campus off that learning center and be juxtaposed from the mass that is that would, I'll go to the next slide, that would be elevated above on the next floors of the laboratories that are organized along Fenton. So this slide is then showing like the entry points for a concept like that would be from the north coming into the building. And then likely another entry off what would be a campus quad on this side. And further stacking on top of that, more laboratories and classroom space. And again, another floor. And then finally, the ultimate building massing once you stack it all up. So then again, this is the 3-dimensional representation of what the building mass would look like as viewed from this vantage point hovering above Takoma Avenue. So you can see the planetarium really creates that sort of screening element that is closer to the residential context, the residential scale. Yeah. Yes. So this is a couple of things to keep in mind. Is like we're still very conceptual in our massing, right? So we do know that there is a dome inside the planetarium. A lot of planetariums these days, that dome is constructed within a rectangular box, just because it's easier to replace later. You're not locked into a geometry. If the technology changes, the architecture is too shrink-wrapped around it, it becomes difficult. So that is a planetarium. Yes? So you'll have to help me. The question is, what would happen with Cosmopolitan Way? Is that the road that cuts through here? This? So we are conveniently ignoring Cosmopolitan Way right now. There will be, once the building placement is organized and understood more completely, we'll be looking at how the site access and vehicles and pedestrian access is organized around it. So right now, we're not really addressing it. It just shows a dead ending right there, but obviously there would be some kind of sensible termination of that vehicular access if it is maintained at all. Sure. Yes, this part. So you can see there's 3 stories visible right here. So keep in mind the grade is sloping. The earth is sloping slightly. So as you come down from Fenton towards the center of campus, you do get a little bit of that building starts to be revealed as they're, right. So it's a sloping site. Okay, so we thought it'd be interesting to share with you what would happen if we directly superimpose the new design on top of the existing building. So here you see in like fire engine red or burnt red, the existing Falcon Hall and Science North as well. Or Science South, sorry. And then the superimposed building massing of that concept that we just looked at on top of it. And so you can see the relationship of the planetarium to the existing Falcon Hall are very similar. It has a very similar presence. Where you do see some deviation is how the building is massed along Fenton Street. So again, that's that larger laboratory bar. And then some additional mass of the building interior to the campus. And then a view of that same concept as hovering above the CSX and Metro Rail tracks. So you see the long bar, and it's bent to follow the curve along Fenton. We are not in that sort of initial setback zone that we're actually allowed to build out to, but pushed back closer to Science North so that there is an alignment there. And then a gentle bend to keep the building, to allow for the same setback along Fenton as you progress south across the site. Yes? So that is a direct reaction to some of the comments we heard at the last meeting, that there was some fear or some negative perception of what that would mean. So we've actually proven to ourselves that we don't need to. So if we don't need to, then why would we sort of put you guys in that position? So. So the setback, the existing Falcon Hall was 110 feet, so that's where this line is. The height here, this is 3 stories. So it's significantly, it's 3.5 actually. It's 3.5 basically right here, but not on Fenton. Okay, so one of the things we were mentioning earlier is the importance of daylighting. This diagram is trying to show how daylight would penetrate into the building. And as I was saying before, buildings today, daylighting is such an important aspect of having a very successful academic institution and facility. So we want to make sure that there are not only a good ability to bring daylight into the building, but also provide great views outside the building. You just can't sort of value those building attributes enough in a new building like this. So what you're seeing here is rendered in yellow where the sun would penetrate in the building, penetrate into the building and provide natural light or access to natural light, which also allows us to reduce lighting loads when we can use a system called daylight harvesting. But it does create that dead zone in the middle where you would not have access to natural light. You probably wouldn't have access to many views. And these are areas where we would like to use programmatic elements or place programmatic elements in those areas where you're not reliant or not needing those kinds of sort of environmental qualities as much. So in this one, in summary, basically this particular scheme meets all the original design directives as spelled out by the president, but it also has a very, some of the other community considerations, a very compact footprint. It consolidates all the labs along Fenton, which was a comment that we heard. It has a large internal campus quad and open space opportunities, and the Learning Center and student activity is located on the campus side. So, okay, we're going to transition to the second concept. So this one we're calling the rotated pavilion. And essentially, it's a very similar organization that we saw in the last scheme, but it has a rotated piece that presents itself to the campus that you're seeing here. So this is that rotated pavilion. But one aspect that I'd like to point out with this plan that's different from the last one is that all these white boxes, which are the laboratories, there's actually 3 rows of them. In the last scheme, there were 2, or the last plan, there were 2. So what this does is it creates an internal bar of laboratories that, as I was saying before, do not have access to natural light, so that is a compromise. But what it does is it allows us to take that top story of laboratories and push it down within the lower floors. So it effectively lowers the building pretty significantly by 1 floor. So what you're seeing here is like that organization of all the laboratories organized in this rectangular bar, and the yellow is the corridors that services them. One thing that as architects we are very cognizant of is that whenever you have a plan like this where you have many intersecting corridors and there isn't really a lot of access to natural light, it does get very confusing. So this does have a downside in that we will have to work very hard to make sure that the sort of cognitive ability to navigate through this building, especially as a first-time visitor, is very carefully thought about. And there are ways in which we can do it, and a lot of it actually has to do with access to natural light again. Having views and windows out to the outside at the ends of these corridors are great orientation devices. So that's something that we'll have to study very carefully if this is a scheme that we move forward with. So then, just to reiterate, the Learning Center oriented towards the campus here and just off of Takoma Avenue. And in this particular concept, the planetarium is inboard. So it's not an external element. It's actually internalized within the building. So you won't see it as a massing shape, but it is a volume that would be expressed on the inside of the building. Yeah. Okay, so, well, instead of going back to if you remember the program slide, we talked about each program had a series of laboratories and offices, but then there's a common general use area within the building where students can go to study, to meet with a group. They can go get tutoring. They can go have access on a computer. And it's usually more of a resource center. And a lot of times in today's nomenclature, the library is being referred to as a learning center or a resource center like that, because libraries are less about books and more about studying and meeting with your study group and learning how to, or learning with each other and meeting with your faculty or your student peers. Okay, so in a similar fashion, we'll run through these and stack up the building. So again, laboratories are always organized along Fenton Street with that double corridor, and then the planetarium, and then the ultimate massing. So when you see this again, it's slightly different than the last scheme we saw in that there's 1 story below grade on this mass, and then there's 2 stories above grade that you perceive from Fenton, and then that 1 story mechanical screen above. On the campus side, and this is that rotated bar, or the rotated pavilion that we were talking about, you really only have 2 stories, and you only see 2 stories from Takoma Avenue, and a very little amount of that 2-story element projects into that 70-foot setback that we were talking about in the site analysis. So again, we'll do that same exercise where we overlay this concept with the current Falcon Hall, and you can see there's a significant difference in how this building relates in terms of the setback. Falcon Hall is much further out, and the height is very similar between the two. And again, the big difference is how is the building massed along Fenton Street. And then that view hovering above the metro tracks or the CSX tracks is the 2-story element that is very close in height to Science North. And then the building steps around, and then that 2-story element that is facing the campus. And again, I'll just reiterate that we are at a concept stage. We're looking at what we call massing. The building will not be that sort of long and boring. There will be architecture at some point in a future discussion, and we'll talk about how we animate a facade like that to make it take on a characteristic that is contextually responsive to the neighborhood. Yeah. Right. Yes. So I think the question is, when you say neighborhood, do you mean the Fenton Street side or Takoma? Takoma, okay. So the question is, can we step it back? Is that the question? The terrace it back? Yeah. So take 1 story or 1 level and hold it back here versus having an extended portion below it? This one. So you're saying step it back. Yeah. So there is potential to do that, but anything we move back on the upper floor means we have to figure out where that area is below. But conceptually, you could do it. There is a trade-off that I will note, and we've talked about this a little bit up until now, is that with all these laboratories, there's a lot of mechanical equipment that goes into those spaces, and it's very advantageous to stack them up. When you start doing things like having them on 1 floor and not having another laboratory on top of it, it means that you have a lot of ductwork that needs to be accommodated. So it might mean, okay, we have a setback here and there's not a building mass there, but then we're going to have a bunch of equipment sitting there because that's where the HVAC needs to go. So I mean, it's not to say that that's the only option, but those are the kinds of considerations we'll have to think about if that's a massing that we want to pursue. Yeah. So we actually don't have them. So the question was, how does the 150 setback compare to the previous option? I can go back and show you. We are going to have that as part of the breakout room, so you'll be able to see them all together. So, but I think just to generally answer the question, this one is further back. Yeah, right, 120. And this is 150, so yeah, 30-foot difference. Again, the compromise or the issue with this scheme from a programmatic point of view is that there is a kind of a dead zone there in the middle where there isn't a whole lot of access to natural light, and that would be a compromise from the programmatic function of the building. So to summarize, again, we're meeting all of the original commitments that were made by the president in the letter to the community, but then some of the other community considerations, again, consolidating the building with the labs on Fenton Street, putting the learning center on the campus side. This one actually has more floor plate, meaning a wider building to consolidate the program. So I think that was one of the original considerations, was to make the building as low and flat as possible, and lower the elevated, in this particular scheme, because we were able to lower the building, there actually is an opportunity to maybe get some natural light into that lower level. So that's something that will need to be developed as the design moves forward. Yeah. That would be something, so the question is, have we studied the impact of these designs on the lighting in the neighborhood? We are at such an early stage right now where we wouldn't be able to project that lighting impact yet without having a better understanding of what schemes we were pursuing. But it is something we can do. It just takes a lot more time and analysis. And it's something we usually do when we're closer to a finalized design option. So blocking sunlight, so the shadows created by this building. Okay, so I think, I don't know if you can tell, did we have the shadows on? So when you say block light, the only light it would block, I mean, we don't have the shadows turned down, I don't think, or actually, are they? No. So, you know, the maximum amount that a shadow would be projected from this building would be its own height by a factor of maybe 2. So the shadows would never extend beyond the building property. Right, true, so that's the south side. So all the shadows would be ideally in most solar orientations going to the north or to the east, and that most of the sun originates from this side. So shadows would not be projecting into that part of the neighborhood. So the question is, what happens to the parking area south of Falcon Hall? And right now we don't know. I mean, it's something that the college has asked us to analyze at a later date. There's no commitment to add parking, and there's no commitment to maintain any parking. So the idea is that we're going to resolve that at some point, but there's no pressure to put more in. We know that. It's a good question. So the question is, would you articulate this facade in a curved manner similar to the student union? And the answer is, yeah, we could. I mean, we haven't really, as we were talking about the process of architecture and design, usually we like to get the big masses and the bulk pieces of the building organized on the site first. And then we go into like, how do we sculpt it? How do we make it into architecture? This is kind of architecture, but architecture light. It's not quite there yet. Once we understand where the big sort of moves are, then we can get in and like, okay, how do we make it sculpt this building and detailed in a way that is sensible to not only the programmatic needs, but the context of the neighborhood, and how do we relate to that? So, okay. Okay, so this is the last option we'll be sharing with you. And this is called distributed bars. And essentially, It repeats a very similar organization where we're trying to keep all the laboratory buildings or laboratory functions along Fenton Street. This replicates the placement of the planetarium in a somewhat similar fashion on the south end of the building. And then the Learning Center is slightly different in this format, and I actually forgot to mention on the previous concepts, is that the Learning Center was stacked on 2 floors. This particular concept takes the Learning Center and leaves it on 1 floor. Similar to what we were talking before, there's a programmatic need or a drive by that department to all be organized on 1 level. So we're going to study that. In all the concepts, we can study that iteration, but this is in this particular concept, we thought, well, let's see what happens if we just organize it all on 1 floor. So here we have, again, there's a 155-foot setback, and the main entry for the building could be on the southeast corner here, and the planetarium could have a very similar function as we were mentioning in the earlier concept that since it doesn't have any windows and it would face Takoma Avenue, it could provide a very sort of sensible architectural element without a lot of distraction and windows facing the south. So again, stacking up the building. One aspect of this particular concept that is a little different is that that mass of the planetarium is sort of nestled within a lower roof form. And then as the building grows up around it, there is an opportunity for what could be an occupied terrace or something like that, that would be, again, sort of internal to these massing shapes and screened by the planetarium. So just to summarize, this particular option is 3 stories on Fenton with a mechanical penthouse. It would be effectively 3 stories on the internal campus side, 2 stories on Takoma, where we're in the setback area of the planetarium, and then a particular small piece of it could be 1 story on the Takoma Avenue side, with it rising up to 3 stories as it gets deeper into the campus. So again, looking at that exercise where we overlay it with the existing Falcon Hall, and as you can see, it is, again, considerably further back from the existing Falcon Hall, such that even some of the massing of the planetarium is actually lower than Falcon Hall. And again, looking at the building organization as viewed from above on the metro tracks and CSX with the long bar on Fenton, the planetarium 155 feet off of Takoma, and then the other program distribution sort of pulled back from that with a relief and lower building plinth with the elevated building beyond. And again, the daylight solar analysis, again, the big compromise here, we do get pretty good penetration of light in these thinner building elements that is actually pretty good, but it's that lower level that is below that roof terrace where there is not a whole lot of access to natural light. And again, to summarize, this does meet all the original design directives. It creates, the unique part about it is it does create a series of outdoor spaces around the campus. So there's a little outdoor space on the north side, there's a terrace we talked about on the south side, and it does frame a courtyard to the campus. The Learning Commons is organized on the campus side again, and the scale of the building minimizes the width and increases the access to natural light. So as we were saying, the thinness of some of these building elements really allows the light to penetrate very effectively on the upper floors, but just not on that lower floor. So that is my part of the presentation. Now your part starts, even though you guys did have a lot of great questions. So Michael's going to give us a little bit of instruction how we're going to move on into the work groups.
Thank you, Bob. My team in the back captured all the questions that were answered. Those will be logged with the answers that Bob gave and put up online as well for people who weren't in the room. We're going to break up based on the numbers on your name tag. In each room, just to reiterate, there'll be an architect, a facilitator, and a note taker. We're all adults. We want this to be a discussion, so we're not going to call on people. But as we get in there, to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak, if you wouldn't mind just throwing up your hand as we get a feel for the room, and then we really want this to be a back and forth. What do you like? What don't you like? What questions do you need to get up and kind of kind of look at the map to really get answered. Room 1 is the internal considerations room. That's the one faculty, student, staff, if you want to talk about the stuff that's more interior to the building, et cetera, at that level of detail, that's on this floor. The other 4 rooms are upstairs. When you leave, there are refreshments, both food and drink. You can take those into the classrooms, so grab some food. Architecture and planning go better, not on an empty stomach. So we're going to do that. Use the restroom if you need it. We'll spend about 45 minutes together in the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back here and report out and send everyone home. Sound good? Great, thank you. Okay, we ready to report out? Perfect. I was in group 2. I humbly submit it was the best group, best discussion. Group 2, yeah, it was good. We are going to go through groups 1 through 5. We're going to report out. Group members come up, give us a high-level overview. If folks in the audience have questions, this can be very free-flowing. But group 1, who wants to report out from group 1? Rashad, come on up, sir.
Oh, okay. Make it official. Okay, thank you. Okay, hello. So group 1 was students, staff, and faculty. Put this here. We had a lot to discuss. I believe what started our conversation was talking on the planetarium. It led our discussion. So we mainly were worried about space for storage in the planetarium, depending on the size or type of the dome, access to the classrooms possibly from planetarium, and with the connections to other buildings, specifically the Science North building, where those connections are going to be maintained, like the skywalk that's there, or would there be a new connection or walkway? The Cosmopolitan Way was a major point also, and that had to do with the second major theme, which was giving it a sense of place and maintaining the spine that we have down the campus, orientation there. So will that still be some type of resource for the community or facilities personnel to do what they need to do with maintenance or whatnot? The third main idea was lighting, internal lighting. So the staff and faculty were wanting a little light in their offices, and you know, even with ways to introduce lighting to the middle portions of the building. If we did a large space like was done in Science Center in Rockville, will there be, you know, no violations to code, or at least will code allow for meetings to be held still in those spaces? And so with the lighting aspect had to do with the trees. One individual who was a part of the community felt that the trees might have been at a good volume and height, or right as they are. Let's see, another individual who's familiar with the history mentioned something about the aesthetics of the angled building, how it used to be that way in the old electrical building facility that used to be here. That just had to do probably more so with aesthetics. I believe that that's the major things. There was slight talk about the labs, the functionality of the labs that I believe we'll be talking about later when we talk about the operations things.
Appreciate it. Anyone else from Group 1 have anything to add? Any questions for Rashad? Great. I facilitated Group 2 with Jamie over here, and the group asked me to report out, so I've got our chart here. At a very high level, gut check-wise, people seem to be a little bit towards option number 3 for a couple different reasons. Number 1, it was set back most from the neighborhood, and some of the very adjacent neighbors said it was a bit closer to what they wanted back in the day when they wanted Science North to be where the building was located, so anything that pulls it more in that direction was a good thing. There was lots of discussion about the terrace and how the terrace could actually be a nice amenity to that building, but making sure there was a better understanding of how the terrace wouldn't have an adverse impact on the surrounding neighborhood. What are the view lines like from there? Can people see into the adjacent neighborhood homes? What are the noise implications of a terrace? And just exploring that a bit more. There was discussion about how options 1 and 3, people liked where the placement of the planetarium was, with it being kind of front and center of the building. There was a discussion about an option 2, could you switch the learning center and the planetarium to see what that would do with the programming. The other thing that people liked in our group about option 3 is how it was a collection of smaller elements, so it made the building feel less monolithic, was the words that was used. A couple questions. There was a question about why the building has to be this big, and that was a question about what was the programming that led to this building being this size. Sandra was in our room at that time and gave a really good overview of kind of what leads to an ed spec and a size of building, and we're going to try and post some of that information because it was a good discussion. There was a bunch of discussion about where the idea that nothing could be closer to Fenton came from, and the adjacent neighbors in our group said, build as close to Fenton as you can if it can reduce the massing of the building. No one lives over there, build as close as you can. And then finally, we had a lot of good discussions about the pickup and drop-off zones around the campus, and understanding that there are some pickup and drop-offs that happen on Takoma and Fenton, et cetera. And if we know that, how do we build the planning for that into the design of this building? Group 2, anything I missed in that overview? Sue? Yep. Yes, and that was one of the discussions about why can't you go closer to Fenton. There was some discussion that maybe you want that setback because that's where the loading docks and unloading would happen on that side of the building. Sir? Yes, that's a very important one. We're experiencing this at a very high level now as a bird flying over the site, but as we get further in the design, helping to understand what the massing looks like from front porches and street level, et cetera. Great, it was a good discussion. Group 3. Sir.
Thank you. You can just get the other two. Thank you. There we go. You can put that right there. Thank you, Josh. I'm Richard Wheel with Group 3. We had Bob from Smith Group and Josh with Link, and we had representatives from the neighborhood as well as the college, and it was a good meeting. It was very interactive. Concerning the first concept, thank you, Josh, we talked about using the entry point as a way to influence the flow of foot traffic. That went back to a basic question of, in terms of the program, how many people are coming? Are there more people coming to the college now? So to just address that question. We also, again, to the first concept there, the framed edge, we talked about there might be as prominent as a walk down Takoma Avenue. Just wondering about the pedestrian foot traffic. Most of it, I think, comes from the metro, which is from the north of the site, but we're just wondering how that might be affected from the south of the site as well, where the building's placed and how students would enter off of Fenton or Takoma. Most people appreciated the dog leg of the along Fenton, of the massing of the building along Fenton, because it sort of mirrored a little bit of the student center, the Charlene Nunley Student Center that was just built, maybe it's 8 years ago now. And a few more items, questions. Okay, will more students be coming to the campus with the building? So that's a question. And how will students navigate the campus with the new building? It'll create sort of a general commons area inside where part of the tennis courts are now. That'll create a new quad area, which, again, it's where the tennis courts are now. On concept number 2, the rotated pavilion, we talked about a fairly abrupt prominence along Fenton. Again, that addresses maybe there could be a dog leg or a curve, but right now we're just looking at major massing to address the square footage requirements. Potential to use curved articulation in the building facade towards the southern end on Fenton as well was brought up. Everyone asked about indicating the campus access points and foot traffic flow. So that's where cars might enter for parking, where they do right now, whether that's going to remain or not during construction, where the construction entrance is, which my understanding is it probably will still be off of Fenton, maybe a common area where some of the delivery and loading dock areas are now. And then I think that was mainly it. And then, so during construction, but then when the building's complete, where delivery's made to the new building. On number 3, one of the challenges was not having enough light for the first floor level. And because there's that green level, sort of a zigzag there that you see in number 3, thank you, very nice. The thought was maybe, in addition to being a green roof, there could be some skylights there, and that might allow some natural light down into the building, albeit through 3 foot of structure and maybe 3 foot of mechanical, but that might work out. What was appreciated in concept number 3 was the setback from Takoma. sort of a gentle setback. It had different things going with the planetarium, the one story, the sort of, again, the green roof. And the last item was the green roof space has potential for student learning applications, and I guess that's maybe whether it's a, it's a green roof that they can have experiments out there or not, or just new sorts of plantings. And so that is our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Any questions or comments, Group 3? Group 2 also talked about skylights quite a bit too, so it's neat to see that overlap. 4? They ask you to do it 4 and 5.
4 and 5. So we combined our group together, 4 and 5. Pretty unanimously, concept 3 was preferred. Concept 1, we had a good discussion about sort of the alignment on Takoma Avenue, and how while it's pushed back on Fenton, that wasn't preferred, that 3 stories there. Concept 2 was considered fine, but really what everyone really liked about concept 3 was the opportunity for outside green space and outside learning space. Other elements that we discussed were green space on the roof and to take advantage of learning space possible on the roof, and really optimizing that space. Also talked about an atrium, and so to have that oriented to help with some of the natural lighting in the interior of the building. And then another big concern we discussed was the loading dock, and to be sure that's away from residences and as far up Fenton and north, as close to Science North as possible. That covers it mostly. Any other feedback on that group 4 and 5? Good? Great.
Great. So that wraps us up. Here are our next summer office hours. Our next charrette is in September. Are there any overall questions or comments before we wrap up? We're going to take everything from this time. If you looked at the chart of everything that was written out last time, even though we didn't have the Post-it notes, we got a lot of feedback, and there were note takers in all the rooms. So our job is going to be to turn that all into something that's usable, provide responses to anything that needs responses, get that all up online. As we're doing the summer office hours, we'll continually be updating the feedback we're getting, so please check back. It'll be very iterative, and we're all available if you have questions between meetings. Sound good? Great. Susan. Great. Do you want to talk about that, Bob? I'm sorry, the question was, what do you think will happen in the next charrette? What does that one look like? And I nicely gave it to Bob.
Yeah. So that actually came up in our breakout group or work group as well. So the idea is that we are not settling on one scheme, one concept tonight. And if you guys all came to us and said, hey, it's scheme 3 or it's option 3 and we're done, it would be great. We'll all go home and cancel the rest of the meetings. But that's not going to happen. We understand that. So we are going to continue to refine each of these concepts based on the feedback we got tonight and the feedback that we're going to get over the summer hours. And when we come back in September, it sounds like most likely there's still at least 2 options, if not 3, that we have to keep analyzing and see how we can refine it further to meet all the comments that we've heard tonight and all the other concerns that have been raised to date. So as we were saying before, ideally what we're doing is we're slowly going down a path of focusing in on one ultimate solution, but we don't want to go there too soon if people aren't ready to do that. Yep, we will definitely take that into consideration. Yep. I think it's definitely it's not our vacations that are preventing that from happening. So.
I have a 7-week-old at home. There are no vacations. Any other questions or comments? Great, thank you. This was a long meeting, and you guys hung in there, and you got a lot of feedback, so thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you.